So it's still over a year away until the 2024 American presidential election. But one of the themes that will arise in that is the positions that the candidates have on Ukraine and Russia. That's a major issue of our times, and that will inevitably be one of the issues. Now, I say candidates because, and I don't want to talk too much about American presidential politics here, but you know, there's a lot of concerns about Biden's age, and he's showing it. And there's a lot of concerns about Trump, period, because he's, in my opinion, he's the most corrupt president in American history. I think he even Nixon's. Um, I think it's a very bad choice between Biden and Trump. If I had to choose, I'd probably choose Biden, but that wouldn't be, likely. I think he's far too prone to pandering to woke intolerance and woke dogmas. But I basically can't stand Trump. I think he's an appalling figure. Um, so I'm thinking more of some of the younger people around, some of the people who may well challenge either of these candidates. And as it stands, the Democrats sort of see Biden as not a great president with him, and Trump has a big hold over the Republican Party. So probably it will be a rerun of Biden versus Trump, will be a pretty toxic election, unfortunately. But if that isn't the case and one of the other candidates run, there's a few people I would definitely be very wary of. I think DeSantis is in many ways Trump Junior. Um, there's one big issue. I mentioned Russia and Ukraine, and it could be found on both the left and the right. It's particularly a domain of American conservatives, troublingly, and that is basically apologia for Putin. Now, this phenomenon can be seen in Europe as well. We certainly have plenty of Putin cheerleaders in this country. I say plenty, I think there's too many, but there's still a minority. And the overwhelming majority of the British public realise what Putin is. He's a tyrant who threatens the stability of a continent. I think most people have their heads screwed on properly and can see that. But there is still a minority of people who, for whatever twisted reason, support Putin. Um, Either the Russian nationals who are supporting him for that reason, but more often than not, they're actually British citizens who basically they dislike bodies like NATO, the European Union, and basically Western bodies, and so they sort of gravitate towards Putin because they think his Russia is the answer to some of the woke progressiveness in the West. They look at things like trans dogma and all that sort of stuff, which I don't like either. But I think they are so misguided to think that Putin's Russia is somehow the alternative. So therefore they must support it. That's a incredibly narrow worldview, a very troubling worldview. Threatening my screen here. Um, anyway, they are in Britain, and I have no space for them. I think they're traitors, basically. Um, I'm not going to mince my words. That's what I think of them. And I think if they work in areas like the military or academia, depending on which department they're in, certainly in the government, I think they should be treated as traitors. If they're citizens who aren't in that domain, then they should just be treated with scorn. I really do feel that strongly because, as far as I'm concerned, Putin is a threat to Europe. He's a threat to this entire continent. The biggest threat since Adolf Hitler. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. This screen is going all over the place. Um, but it's interesting that in the United States there is a troublingly big minority. It's not like it's much bigger, I would say, than the UK. Part of this can be explained by the fact that there has always been a contingent. I don't know if you guys can see this, but the screen's going crazy at the moment. Let's see. I'll just end this before continue. It's hard to focus when it's like this crazy. I'll try anyway. I'm not sure if you can see that. Okay, so there's always been a contingent of the American um, political watchers, let's say, who have been wary of European politics. That is to say, it's always been the case that Americans have wanted to stay out of European affairs. There's always been that isolationist strain within American politics, and it's been found in both left and right. In both world wars, it was only when there was a direct attack on American interests if they get involved. And this is not to minimize the sacrifice of American troops, not at all. But that is a reality. In the First World War, 1917, and the Second World War, of course, after Pearl Harbor. Um, so I think there will be many Americans who say this is Europe's problem. But part of the issue with that is it's coupled with an ignorance. It's coupled with an ignorance of the actual facts on the ground. The fact that Putin's foreign policy is directed by irredentism, and that the whole point of this invasion was this distorted sense that somehow Ukraine is not a sovereign state and it's reclaiming lost Russian territory. Even if there was any legitimacy in that, most countries find some diplomatic solutions. Russia's answer is this brutal invasion, which has displaced millions, killed tens of thousands. It's just a very brutal war, you know. And I think the bitterness is going to last for years. Even if the war ends next year, it'll probably be decades before there's any real reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia. And it comes down entirely to Putin and his nationalist cronies. And I feel sorry for ordinary Russians. I've said this before. Those Russians who are anti-Putin and who do speak out against the war, they're trapped between both worlds. On one hand, they have to deal with Putin's Russia, utterly intolerant of dissent. And then they'll also, they'll be tarred with the same brush. Ukrainians will basically hate every Russian. It's not fair, but it's a human reaction to that sort of situation. Um, there's a generational thing there. It's a bit like how a lot of British people felt after the Blitz for years afterwards. And I'm not saying, that wasn't even a home invasion with what the Ukrainians were putting up with. Um, I mean, basically, this country has been brutalized and attacked relentlessly for the last year and a half. And it's only the courage of the Ukrainian people and Western support, something that Ukraine needs to remember, of course. Um, but, just watch for what Russian apologists and Russian nationalists will try to do. They will try to sew up any divisions that there is, any any sort of tensions. I mean, an example might be that Zelensky is frustrated about Ukraine not getting fast tracked to NATO. Well, be absolutely guaranteed that they will exploit that. And they will say, oh, this shows Zelensky's true agenda or the West's true agenda. The truth is, Zelensky is doing everything he can as the head of state to protect his country, everything he can. It's a wartime situation. Do they really think that Churchill and Lincoln um, didn't take tough decisions, didn't do everything in their power to protect their countries during wartime? This is the thing that critics of Zelensky seem to overlook. And I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he's never made mistakes as president. But I do think under the circumstances, taking on a much more powerful enemy, I think he has done his level best as president of Ukraine to get these decisions right. And there's going to be internal divisions in Ukraine. Of course there is. Just as Churchill had arguments with his generals. That's normal in wartime. But I think the resolve of the Ukrainian people is universal. And thankfully, the resolve of most Western allies. Now, Turkey's just relented. Sweden is now formally on the path to join NATO. Hasn't had a formal ceremony yet, but it's basically joining NATO. And again, it's the same principle of what happened with Finland. This is not a provocative move by Sweden. This is something that their hand has been forced by Russia's aggression. Basically, countries are joining NATO for protection. Now, the alternative worldview, this revisionist worldview, this distorted worldview, and you'll hear it from all sorts of sources, is that this is a provocation against Russia. Because in this twisted, distorted worldview, Russia is somehow the victim. This is laughable. Now, even in India, and I'm not impressed by India's track record in this. I think sitting on the fence that they've been doing, it's cowardly. It's politically cowardly. It makes some sense in terms of trade, but I think India has failed as the world's biggest democracy by sitting on the fence. Yeah, you expect it from China and Iran and other totalitarian states, but I think India has failed um, to speak out against Russian tyranny. But even in India, when Lavrov made a speech a while back claiming that Russia were the victims, he was met with laughter by Indian students. That says a lot. But anyway, to get back to America, I saw a bit of a speech by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, granted, I didn't watch the whole speech, but I saw some snippets of it, and what I saw, I was not impressed with. Obviously has the Kennedy name. He may or may not go far. He's got a bit of a reputation as being a bit of a conspiracy theorist and an outsider. But one thing which really made me squirm was when Kennedy came out and said that this was somehow NATO provoked this war. And he went down that trajectory of saying that this was all, we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine and we're not helping the Ukrainian people by supporting them. That's just a distorted worldview. Now, the Kennedy family, on one hand, there's a real noble side, the symbolic of freedom and symbolic of a lot of good values, but it has to be remembered. Joseph Kennedy Sr., that is RFK Junior's grandfather, was an appeaser of the Nazis. This is a fact. So the Kennedy family hasn't always been that noble, and I think that because they've had a tragic history, because two of the brothers were martyred, it shouldn't put up this kind of protection around them. And I think Robert Kennedy Jr. is an idiot. I think that his worldview is dangerous. In fact, I might be wrong. It might not be that he's an idiot. It might be that he actually really genuinely believes that this is the right approach, and he is a dangerous isolationist. I say dangerous because this is a man who, if he ever gets into the White House, would basically say the Ukrainians are on their own, therefore the Baltic states are on their own if Russia attacks them. It would be the most cowardly form of isolationism. That would be extreme cowardice, the world's most powerful country to turn a blind eye, and that is effectively what RFK Junior is saying, and I think it's a disgrace. Um, who knows what his father would have done? Certainly, his father spoke out against the Vietnam War. That was a very different conflict. What I really, really have a problem with is those who frame all Western policy as one and the same and all conflicts as one and the same when they're not. They're really not. And I think this sort of isolationism, I mean, it's basically like the Ron Paul school of thought. Um, and there's other prominent American politicians who take this position. Then you get someone like Trump, who I think has a very, very shady record when it comes to Putin. Not once in 4 years did Trump personally criticize Putin. I think that really is a red flag. True, on his watch, the State Department expelled Russian diplomats, but frankly, the Trump administration was chaotic. I think that there was a real inconsistency in his foreign policy when it came to, for example, Russia, when it came to tyranny. On one hand, he condemned tyrants. I give him credit where credit's due. He took action against Assad, but he stood beside Vladimir Putin and basically, denounced American media, and he tried to score cheap points over Biden. Shamefully, 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 on the day of the invasion, Trump said it was a genius move by Putin. Why? To get some cheap points over Biden. This is despicable, absolutely despicable. On one of the darkest days in their history, what sort of message does that send out to the Ukrainian people? So I think if Trump gets back into the White House, I think there'd be a real danger that he'd try to have some sort of deal with Putin, which would basically mean telling the Ukrainians to give up the country. That would be utterly, utterly shameful. Utterly shameful. And what I find most repulsive about its isolationist worldview is it's molded as pacifism. It's molded as pacifism, but is it a pacifist position to let tyrants like Putin do as they please? Is that a pacifist position? Because it's turning a blind eye to their warmongering. And I think it's odious for someone like RFK Jr. to say that it's NATO that started this war, to frame it that way, which he has effectively done. There's others. Tulsi Gabbard, I've never trusted her. I think she's a cheerleader for foreign tyrants, and she's not consistent when she's called out on it. Of course, she'll say, "Oh well, yes, Assad's a dictator, Putin's a dictator," but she seems to be very uncomfortable criticizing these guys. I don't trust her, and she'll probably run again. So that's why I'm mentioning her name. But what I find repulsive about this sort of position is they frame themselves as pacifists, and they frame someone like Joe Biden as a warmonger. Biden has armed Ukraine, and the recent, issue with cluster bombs, yes, it's controversial, but it must never, ever, ever be forgotten that this was a war begun by Russia. Now, if the world's most powerful country, the United States of America, was to turn a blind eye to this brutal invasion of a sovereign nation, that would be unfathomable. That would be the equivalent of 1939. Well, indeed, let's not forget America's record in this. 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. You know, It took 2 years for the United States of America to enter the war, not from Roosevelt, but again from Congress. So there has always been this isolationist mindset in American politics, and I don't think it's noble. I don't think it's pacifist. I think it's cowardly. This is not to say that America should just go in guns blazing to every situation. That is not what I'm saying. And of course, there's been many, many American wars that were deeply immoral. But I think the isolationist approach as this extreme alternative, there's nothing noble about it. Where's the leadership in that? That's cowardice. That is not leadership. That's cowardice. Saying, well, that's just your problem. We're going to leave you on your own. To me, that is despicable. Utterly despicable. So I hope RFK Junior, Tulsi Gabbard, and those other Putin appeasers don't get anywhere near the White House. They'll kick up a bit of noise. If it is Biden running, I really don't think he's an ideal candidate. But if it is him running, which he probably will, I hope he sticks by his guns and continues to support Ukraine. Because really, this idea that Ukraine should just give up their country, it may bring temporary peace insofar as the West would no longer be funding Ukraine and arming Ukraine, and then there'd technically be peace with Russia for a while. But what would happen? You'd have a Ukrainian insurgency. You would have, it wouldn't end the war because Ukrainians understandably would want to take their country back. This idea of telling a people, just give up your country. My point to Indians, to Americans, to anyone who thinks that that is the solution to this, it's deranged. And I would say, would you take those values for your own country? If your country was invaded, would you say, oh, just give up? I argued with a Vietnamese friend of mine a while back because her attitude was just, oh, well, Vietnam went through this long period of war. And that's what, she was sort of making the point that's the price of war. The difference is, and I pointed out to her, well, the Vietnamese people, they'd been invaded by the Chinese, by the French, by the Americans. They didn't give up. And actually, within Vietnam, there were a lot of atrocities committed by the Viet Cong, but, I'm derailing the point here. The point is, the Vietnamese didn't give up. They were never prepared to surrender their country. So why I put it to her, do you expect the Ukrainians to do that? And she didn't have an answer for that. And I'm not saying she was a Putin supporter. I'm not framing it that way. She basically sat on the fence with that. But the fact of the matter is, most countries now recognise what is obvious. At the recent UN vote, most countries called on Russia to withdraw. 7 countries out of 200 support Russia. Even, Russia supporters like China didn't openly support the invasion. Now that's saying something. That is saying something. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but for me, I am enormously suspicious of any politician whose first instinct in a situation like this is to condemn NATO, to condemn the West, and they cannot bring themselves to condemn Russia. I would treat them with great suspicion. There's a market in this. There's a market in this because RFK Junior is a conspiracy theorist. So he'll say this is the deep state. This is the NATO controlling American foreign policy. This is he'll frame it as something very sinister and very different from what it is, rather than American leadership. His attitude is basically, it's Europe's problem, it's Ukraine's problem, leave them to it. Let's be friends with Russia. Let's appease Russia. That's absolute cowardice. And if he does get further, I hope he's called out on it. I hope Biden, fires back. Because RFK Junior is going to portray Biden as a warmonger. Biden's not a warmonger. Biden did not start this war. This is one of the false narratives that Putin cheerleaders come out with. And it is just a plain lie. It's just a lie. Even, during the war in Syria, when the West took action against ISIS, partly because of their savagery in Syria, but also because of terrorist attacks in the West, again, it was Western warmongering. But this was not a war started by the West, it was a war started by the Assad regime, backed up by Russia. When you get into the tentacles of Russian disinformation, it's absolute poison. It's absolute poison, and millions of people are taken in by it. And it makes me sick. I cannot understand why an Indian or a Kenyan would look at what's happening in Ukraine and be so ignorant as to think that somehow Russia is the victim. Why? Because NATO has expanded by, countries being forced into this position. Well, what do they have to say to the Ukrainians? Do they not accept Ukrainian sovereignty? Do they not respect it? It's a staggering hypocrisy I find hard to stomach. If their countries were invaded, they would have something to say about it. Um, so, I am 150% with Ukraine to the end. The only way this ends is by Ukraine winning the war. Now, this isn't going to happen soon. It is going to be long and bloody. It's going to be this Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be long and bloody, and it's an utter tragedy. But this is entirely at Putin's hands. All those young Russian soldiers who are dying, 100% Putin's fault. I mean, you can't blame the Ukrainians for that. They have to defend their country. And unlike the Wagner thugs, they treat prisoners of war generally in a humane way, given the circumstances. The distortion, the way Ukraine's been vilified by Putin apologists is just disgusting. Um, and whatever injustices may have existed in Donbass, because this is when history is written, people would say, well, Russian speakers were persecuted and, Ukraine was provoking Russia all this time. If that were true, to the extent that Russia claims, I'm not going to say it was perfect. No country is. But if it was as bad as Russia made out, they would have presented a solid case to the UN years ago. They failed to do so. When they rigged that, referendum in Crimea, when they intimidated Ukrainian speakers, it was a completely flawed referendum. But even, let's play the devil's advocate and say there was a majority that genuinely wanted to live under Russia. Well, many of those people will have changed their mind on the day of the invasion when they saw Russia's true colours. Russian speakers were killed. It's just so, I cannot fathom how anyone could be so deranged as to think that Russia is somehow the victim in all of this. It infuriates me. And then when you get when you get Putin's attack dogs openly talking about nuclear war against the West, and then you get people in the West still playing Putin's useful lapdogs. I mean, do they not realize how stupid they look? But I think it's a much bigger problem in America. There's more Putin apologists in America than there is in any Western country. You get them everywhere. You get them in Canada and Britain and Holland, but especially in America, and it's very troubling if that's the direction of American politics. So if Biden does run again, I really, really hope he sticks by his guns on this, and I hope the American people see common sense and realize that this was a war of aggression started by Russia, and you simply cannot appease a tyrant. And I hope Biden exposes Trump in this. This is not to say that I think Biden's a great candidate. Like I say, a lot of his domestic politics I think is terrible. But this is such an important issue of geopolitics. The concern I have is if America and the West gives up on Ukraine, that will enable Putin, because he is counting on this, he's counting on division in the West. It will enable Putin and his regime to basically go ahead and take over the country. Ukraine would never forgive the West. They'd see it as a betrayal, a bit like some countries did after the Second World War. Those countries that fell to communism. Poland felt aggrieved about that for a long time. It would be something similar, but I think that it would also give Putin the green light to go ahead into Moldova, the Baltic states. It would be absolutely unfathomable for that to be an option. The only way this ends is when Russian forces are forced to withdraw, and if that takes years, unfortunately, it's the only way. Because the alternative isn't actually peace. Because even in temporary ceasefire, you will have a Ukrainian guerrilla movement. So there'll never be peace in Ukraine until Russia withdraws. That's the reality.